I've been preaching from the book of 1 Samuel, going through the story of David, if you are new to us here today. And we are continuing the story of David, a man after God's own heart, the story of one of the greatest kings in Israel. We would expect to hear in this story, working through 1 Samuel, a brief history of all the great things that David did and what God did through David to build up the nation of Israel. But the Bible is not just a flattering account of David's life. It is also a story about the challenges that David faced and some of the decisions he made in disobedience to God. The Bible paints a very real picture of David's humanity. It does not avoid giving an account of his sins. And these stories, they teach us. They give us lessons about the challenges that we face in life. They are examples to us when we face temptation to pursue our own way rather than the will of God. And they are also an encouragement that God can and does use imperfect people, and that He can transform us to be the children of God that He desires us to be. So with that in mind, turn in your Bibles, if you have them, to 1 Samuel chapter 27. 1 Samuel 27 is the story of David when he takes his army into the land of the Philistines after he's been running from Saul and Saul's pursuit of David. So 1 Samuel 27, beginning at verse 1, where it says, David thought to himself, "One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand." So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched after him. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in the Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jeremiel, or against the Negev of the Kenites." He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever." In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in battle, in the army." David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish replied, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." And down to chapter 29 verse 1, where it says, The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commander of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over 1 year. And from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting." How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David that they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve me in the army. From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. And then the chapter 30 at verse 1, where it reads, David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord. The story of 1 Samuel is a story of David's misstep, his mistake. It is a story of when David took his eyes off of God and relied instead on his own mind. This morning I would like us to look at the mind of David as he decided to make his way into the land of the Philistines. What was the perspective that influenced his decision? I would also like to look at King Achish and his approval of David, how he put complete trust in David as David strung him along in his plot to survive. Finally, I would like to look at what it took for God to realign David's perspective, what it took for him to finally realize his sin. And along with these 3 points, there are 3 questions that I'd like us to think about. The first one is, what are some of the wrong views we can have about God? Secondly, what are some of the wrong views we can have about mankind? And thirdly, what will it take for God to change our views? The story begins with David's decision to take himself and his army into Philistine territory in order to escape the pursuit of Saul. Some of you might be wondering, why would we class this as a misstep of David? Wasn't it a good idea for David to get out of the land of Israel? Wasn't it a good idea for David to get away from Saul? Could we really blame David for wanting to go where Saul would leave him alone? But the problem is less about David's decision and more about what motivated his decision. Look at verse 1. It says, "But David thought to himself, 'One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hands.'" This is a different response than the David that we saw in chapter 23. When he asked God about the people of Keilah, he inquired of the Lord and said, "Should I go and rescue the people of Keilah?" In chapter 22, he is told by the prophet Gad to go to Judah, and David listened to them. David stayed in Judah. But here, instead of inquiring of God, we find that David reasoned with himself. He came to the conclusion in his own mind. He thought to himself, this is probably the best thing that I can do. There was no asking God. There was no seeking God's perspective. And instead of remaining in Judah, which was the last message he received from God, was to stay in Judah, but instead of staying there, he ventured into Philistine territory. So what changed his mind? What caused him to venture into Philistine territory? Well, it's hard to imagine the pressure that David was under at this point in his life. Twice now he has been so close, that Saul has been so close to taking his life. Day and night he was living in caves and in the desert, running from an army. I'm sure he was tired. I'm sure he was exhausted. And we could imagine that this pressure that was on him would have affected his decisions in his life, and they would have affected his view about God. Where was God in all of this? Why did it seem like he really wasn't protecting him? And so he says to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. He didn't think that God was going to come through for him. His view of the future included a Saul who finally made it through God's protection and took David's life. Maybe David thought that God's goodwill toward him could be worn out. God had come through every time before, but maybe God was getting tired of bailing David out over and over again. And maybe David wondered what God was thinking. Maybe he thought God was thinking, can't you figure this out, David? Can't you figure this out on your own? Do I have to keep coming back and bailing you out? Don't you have an army? Are you not strong enough to lead them? Maybe he thought it was improper of him to keep asking God over and over again to protect him. Or maybe David thought that God did not have the full power or would not be interested in keeping Saul from eventually taking David's life. Maybe he thought there was some weakness somewhere in God's plan to give David the throne, that God was not fully capable of holding his promise. These limitations, they do exist among people, don't they? At times it seems like we have worn out our welcome with others, or that if we were to ask someone to do something again, that it would be too much, or that the request that we make of people is just not possible. But how often do we give these same limitations to God? How often do we place restrictions upon him? How often are we fooled into thinking that God can get tired of hearing our pleas like people get tired of them? That there is a limit to God's grace? Or how often do we believe that God could miss one of his attempts to protect us, that there might be some little small hole in his armor that people could slip through? Our mistake is to attribute human characteristics to an almighty God. Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 23 speaks of God's character, and it says this: God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? God is not a man that he can become tired of our asking. God is not a man that he can miss the mark, make mistakes, miss even just one small time to protect us from those who wish to do us harm. Nothing can happen that is outside of God's control. God is not a man that we can exhaust his resources. When the pressure became too great for David, he forgot about this. He forgot about the character of God. And he took matters into his own hand. He deceived Achish by telling him that he was raiding against Judean towns and towns that were allied with the Israelite people. In reality, he was raiding towns that were both enemies of the Philistines and of Israel. He didn't want Achish to know the truth, because Achish would catch on that David was loyal to Israel. And so he killed anyone who could reveal the truth to Achish. When he raided a town or settlement, he put every living person that could speak this message to death. The Bible says, and such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. For 1 year and 4 months, David and his men raided villages, killing everyone who could possibly bring a message back to Achish. Imagine the people who died. And I'm sure David had a justification in his mind for what he was doing. He was in a time of war. He was battling an enemy of God's people. He was helping rid the Israelites of their enemies. But David is not God. He does not understand the world as God understands the world. And so his actions were based on his limited understanding. They were not a directive of God's. And as we will see, it gets him into trouble. What do we do when the pressures around us become too great? Do we try to figure things out on our own without consulting God? When we don't ask the question, what does God think about this? We can get caught up in our own limited perspective on life. And we can make a real mess of things. What about the wrong views that we have about mankind? How do they affect what we do? David escaped from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath, in the land of Philistines. Achish no doubtedly knew that David had been pursued by the king of Israel and that he was on the run. And he most likely knew that David was a powerful warrior, a great ally to have, that he had many conquests. He thought he could turn David against the Israelites and use his gifts for his own purposes. And so David began to live in the land of the Philistines, earning a good reputation with Achish. Achish gave him the town of Ziklag, a Philistine town that was on the border of Judea. Achish trusted David, and we see in verse 12 it says, in him talking about David, he has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will become my servant forever. Achish saw in David what he wanted to see. Someone who defected and now was a great weapon against the Israelite people. The other kings who were allied with Israel, or allied with Achish, did not have the same trust as Achish did. They were skeptical of David. They suspected that David really wasn't with them. But Achish was blind. What blindness do we have? What blindness do we give to people? In what ways do we attribute trust in them when that trust should only be attributed to God? We make a significant mistake when we hang our faith on a leader of a church or a great writer or an evangelist rather than God. Because if and when they make mistakes, it throws our world into confusion. The world hangs its faith on people all the time. The world hangs its faith on music personalities, on actors. They hang their faith on them. And it keeps the media in business because there is story after story after story of the failings of these people. And the world is shocked that they would do such a thing. And we can become devastated when people fail us if we attribute to them what can only be attributed to God, a trust that will never fail. And when people fail, especially those who we attribute godliness to, it rocks our faith. If they fail, then how can I trust God? If they fail, then maybe God isn't real. How could God allow others to sin like this? But have we forgotten? People are not God. They are people. And they fail as we fail. We can't view them the way we should view God. The Bible says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Now, I'm not talking about being completely skeptical of people and being completely skeptical of everyone and everything people do. This can be both unhelpful and unproductive. And I'm not saying to be an untrusting person. There are people we can trust. We simply can't put the same weight of trust on them as we would put on God. We need to be wise to the world, its sin and its temptations. And we need to be gracious towards people who have fallen in sin and selfishness. Sometimes it's very difficult to see the truth about people. The closer we are, the more difficult it can be to see. And this was the case with Achish. He was so close to David, so trusting of him, that he couldn't see the plot that David had. What if Achish had been just a little bit more discerning? What if he looked into the hesitation that the other kings had? What if he actually saw for himself what David was up to, rather than just simply listening to the report that David would bring in time after he raided the different towns and villages? Achish didn't see the truth about David. The other nations around Achish did not trust David. Their distance from him allowed them to see more clearly. They could see through David's deceit. Achish only listened to them because he knew he could not continue on in the war without these Philistine leaders. David would eventually become the downfall of Achish. Achish was the king of Gath, and in 1 Chronicles 18, it actually makes special mention of the fact that David took Gath from the control of the Philistines. Achish would have been wise to pay attention to what the other kings were saying. Achish had a wrong view of David. And we often fail fall into the temptation of having the wrong views about mankind, being tempted to give them the kind of faith that only belongs to God. So what will it take for our understanding of God and our understanding of people to change? When we look ahead to the end of 1 Samuel, we see that it took a devastating event for David to see his sin. The Amalekites raided David's town of Ziklag and took his family as captives. And look at David's response in verse 4 of chapter 30. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. This is quite an image of the despair that David had. He was utterly devastated. So why does the Bible highlight that David was so overtaken by grief? Because it shows the result of David's self-reliance. The Amalekites are the exact people that David and his men raided for a year and 4 months. David had mercilessly killed all of their people in the towns that he attacked to hide the plot from Achish. They were the people who David's raiding parties took care of. Killed them all. These people would have been out for revenge, don't you think? Don't you think these people would have wanted to take out David's family, give him a little bit of a taste of his own medicine, show him what it would be like to lose everyone that you love? The men were talking about stoning David, and it was no idle threat. He had put the soldiers' families in real risk, and now their fears had come true. What if the Amalekites returned the same favor to their people? And David's men are beside themselves. Their response shows that they know that their families are either dead or being tortured or being abused. And they were angry with David. And David, he comes face to face with his sin. He saw that his actions had put everyone at risk. He saw that his trust in himself had failed him. Sometimes it takes moments like this to see how far we have fallen, where we come face to face with our own pursuits and what they have accomplished. When we see that the decisions we have made without consulting God have had a dramatic effect on our lives, where we have put ourselves above everyone else, and where we faced with the results of our sin. What is your response in this situation? Do you respond like David's men, setting your sights on someone else, blaming them for the condition that you find yourself in? Do you lash out at others rather than look at your own contribution? Or do you respond like David? He didn't set out to blame anyone. He didn't lash out at someone else for this. He realized he had stepped out of alignment with God, and he went back to God. He asked God, "What should I do?" This is the response that we should imitate. And God does not leave him there alone. He doesn't respond as humankind might respond with a, "See what I told you?" That's not how God responds. He doesn't respond with, maybe if you beg me, I might come and help you. That's not God's response either. God responds to David immediately and helps him. He gives David direction on what he should do. And he keeps the Amalekite people from killing his family in retribution for the killing that David and his men did. David deserved to have his family die. He deserved to have his people wiped out. But God had mercy on him and delivered him. And this is the great theme of the Bible. It is the story of redemption. God always has us. God always saves us in our moment of need. He always has a way forward. It may not always be the most pleasant way out. It may not be without consequence, but it is a way forward. It is a way out. David listened to God at this point, and he obeyed. And God's redemption story is for you. Maybe you, like David, have put your trust in yourself. Maybe you figure that if you live a good life and don't do things too terribly wrong, and if there is a heaven, well, I guess you're going to be there. But if your hope is in yourself, you will be disappointed. In fact, if your hope is in yourself, you are in serious danger. Hope in ourselves is no hope. We cannot save ourselves. But if your hope is in the saving work of Jesus Christ, you will not be disappointed. Those who realize their own sinfulness and believe in God's faithfulness have a real hope in an eternity with God. Some of you are resistant to giving up control in your life. You do not want to hand over your life. And for most of us, there are parts of our lives that we resist giving to God in full submission. You are not sure that you can trust God, that He will come through with you in the tough times of your life. You are not sure you really believe He has what is best for you in life. So what will it take? What will it take for God? What will it take for your view on God to change? What needs to happen in your life before you are gripped with the realities of your own sinfulness and fallenness? What needs to happen for you to see that you really do need God? What will it take before you see that God can help you through the tough times of your life and that it is God who saves? He not only has the desire to save you, He has the power to do it. He has proven Himself. Those who have given their lives to Him, He continually works on. When I think back to my life growing up, I am always amazed at the patience that God has had with me. Even from a young kid, I grew up in a church, and we would go to church club, and some of our clubs you had to stand in a line with all your friends and, pledge your allegiance to God and share a verse, and you would do all this, but in the back when the leader wasn't looking, you were jabbing with your friends and goofing off and not really paying a whole lot of attention, because as a kid, the view of God was that He was way out there somewhere, that He wasn't even looking. But God in His time continued to change my view on that, to show, He is not only close, He is watching, and He is here with me. And God has been patient with me, slowly teaching me over time how intricately God is involved in my life and what He has done for me. And I'm continually humbled by the patience He has had for me in life. And He continues to show me, and I know He will continue to show me areas of life that I need to give over to Him and to trust Him with, because He is trustable. He continues to bring my view of Him more in line with His Word. And this should give us hope. He has not given up on us. David didn't consult God in his decision to go to the land of the Philistines. He had lost faith in God's providence. He didn't think God would come through on His promise to make him king. What do you believe about God that isn't true? Achish put complete trust in God. He was blind to the fact that David was using him. This blindness contributed to the downfall of Gath. What faith do you place in people that should only be given to God? David came face to face with his sin as the Amalekites raiders took off with his family. What will it take for you to see the truth about God? What will it take for you to make steps back to Him? Maybe God is challenging you with some of the beliefs that you have about Him. Maybe it has caused you to evaluate where you've been putting your emphasis in life. Maybe you are seeing that there are some priority changes that you need to make. Next week we are having a ministry fair, as Richard has told you in the beginning of the service. And there will be all of our ministries of our church on display in the church, highlighting what the church has been called by God to be a light to Vernon and to the surrounding areas. You have a chance to look at those and to see where God is calling you to be involved in them. I'd like to challenge you to spend some time this week in prayer, thinking about where God would have you be involved in our church as we step forward in our faith, as we act on our faith, as we desire to be a light in our community. Where do you fit into that picture? Where is God calling you to be involved? Think and pray about that this week. And when you come to the ministry fair next week, I pray that God has really given you insight in where you can be involved in our church. Let's continue to follow and honor God in our lives.